A man in Norwich once hated his neighbours so thoroughly that the grudge has outlived him by 600 years. Sometime in the early 1400s, he lay awake in the dark, listening to the blacksmith's hammers across the lane, and got angry enough to turn the noise into a poem. 22 lines of Middle English fury, copied into a manuscript that belonged to the cathedral priory there. And the thing still exists. It sits in the British Library today under the shelf mark Arundel 292. He never signed it. Probably a monk, given where the book lived, though nobody can say for certain. Best of all, he wrote the noise itself down, the clatter of hammer on anvil spelled out phonetically, in the middle of the night, on and on till morning. He opens by calling them black, smoke-smeared smiths, filthy with soot, and says they are driving him to death with the din of their blows. Such noise at night, he says, no man ever heard. Then he describes them, and you can tell he has stood in a doorway and watched with genuine loathing. Crooked little men shouting coal, coal, blowing their bellows until their brains are ready to burst. He even spells out their panting, breath by breath. They spit, they sprawl, they groan together and gnash their teeth, and they cook themselves beside the fire with those heavy hammers he says are hard to handle. Their aprons are bull hide. Their shins are armoured against flying sparks. The master takes one scrap of iron and stretches it, hammers a smaller piece, welds the two into one, and lays on a third blow. And the curse arrives at the end. May Christ give them sorrow, he writes. May the devil take so foul a racket. No man can get a night's rest for these water burners. Water burners. Brenwateries, in the original spelling. It comes from the quench, the moment a smith plunges glowing iron into the slack tub and the water screams. That hiss, repeated at some terrible hour, was apparently the final insult. The whole poem closes on an image of steam rising off a barrel of filthy water in the dark, while a man across the way lies rigid in his bed, wishing damnation on his neighbours. Strange that this survives at all. The book it lives in is a miscellany, a grab bag of texts the priory happened to own, and the Blacksmith poem was added onto it by a later hand, squeezed onto a leftover page. Somebody was so furious about the forge down the lane that the fury made it into a cathedral library and then outlived the cathedral's whole medieval world. It is one of the only pieces of writing from the entire Middle Ages that stares directly at working blacksmiths for more than a sentence. And it stares at them the way you'd stare at a blocked drain. Every detail in it, though, the soot, the shin armour, the bellows work, the men groaning in the heat at midnight, is a description of a working life, set down by someone who never had to live it. The men making that racket had mostly been making it since they were 7 or 8 years old. Plenty of them were going deaf by middle age. Their forearms carried burn scars scattered like a map of their careers. Their lungs were quietly filling with charcoal dust. A splinter of hot metal in the eye could end the trade, and a scratch across the knuckles could end the life. And both of those things happened constantly, and nobody wrote poems about any of it. So, that's tonight. The medieval blacksmith from the inside. The trade every village needed, and nobody wanted next door. We'll follow the whole arc of it, the childhood, since these men were made young and made hard, the body, and what 30 years at an anvil did to it, the injuries, and what passed for treatment when the nearest thing to a hospital was a barber with a saw, the money, or the lack of it, the graves archaeologists have lifted out of English fens and Norwegian farmyards, the kings who mutilated metalworkers by the dozen in a single winter, and the stories where it gets strange, the devil who kept visiting forges, the nails of the crucifixion, and the ugliest revenge tale in northern mythology, about a smith whose king cut the tendons behind his knees so he could never walk away. Fair warning on that last one, it goes to places even this channel usually avoids. Before the smoke gets thick though, welcome in everyone. Good to have you here, whether you came for the history or came to fall asleep to it. Both are honorable uses of my voice. If you're new, consider subscribing, and either way, do me the usual favor and tell me down in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Scrolling through that thread with a coffee the morning after an upload is genuinely my favorite part of doing this. And thank you sincerely to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them, all the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Right. Back to Norwich and the men who ruined that writer's sleep. He was no lone crank for a start. The same grievance shows up in London's legal records wearing sober clothing, neighbours of an armourer named Stephen at Fryth. An armourer being a specialist smith who hammered out helmets and plate, brought a complaint that the blows of his sledgehammers shook the stone and earthen party walls of their houses, and that the hammering carried on day and night. Day and night is in the actual filing. His workshop shared walls with their bedrooms. When his striker brought the big hammer down, plaster dust drifted onto their pillows, and the smoke from his fire came through the cracks as a bonus. You can hear, underneath the legal language, people at the absolute end of their patience. In 1345, the City of London lost patience with an entire branch of the trade at once. The spurriers, spur makers, smiths who specialized in the ironwork on a rider's heel, were hit with an ordinance that sounds like a letter from an exhausted landlord. Many of the trade, the city complained, wander about all day without doing any work at all, and then, once they are drunk and frantic is the actual phrase that survives. They take to their forges at night, to the annoyance of the sick and of the whole neighborhood. Worse still, they blow their fires up so vigorously that the forges suddenly blaze, endangering themselves and every house on the street. So the city banned night work for the trade outright, with fines doubling for each offense. Strip away the legalese and the scene underneath is vivid. A crew of spur makers rolling home from the alehouse near midnight, firing the coals up while barely able to stand, and hammering until the whole street glowed orange. That war over night noise ran through the last decades of the 1300s, and the Norwich poem almost certainly belongs to it. The scholars who have worked on the text place it inside a wider push to legislate quiet hours in English towns, with Smiths as the prime target. Seen that way, those 22 lines are sharper than a grumble. They're a noise abatement petition wearing a poem's clothes, probably meant to be passed around and enjoyed by everyone else on the lane who hated the forge as much as the author did. Underneath the noise, though, sat a much older fear, and that fear explains the whole geography of the trade. Fire. A medieval town was a bonfire waiting for its match. Timber frames, wattle and daub walls, roofs of thatch or wooden shingle, houses shouldering one another across lanes narrow enough to jump. Inside, the hearth often sat open in the middle of the floor, with the smoke finding its own way up through a hole in the roof, and people bedded down on straw, close to the embers for the warmth. So every night, in towns across England and much of Europe, a bell rang at 8 or 9 in the evening for what Norman French called couvre-feu. Cover the fire, rake the ash over your coals, put out your lights, go to bed. Our word curfew is that bell. Tradition says William the Conqueror enforced it with a conqueror's thoroughness, every flame in England out at the ringing, and that Henry I eased the rule around 1100. Either way, the bell kept ringing for centuries. After it rang, the gates were shut, the taverns emptied, and the watch walked the streets, entitled to grab anyone out in the dark without a light and a good excuse. A town at night was supposed to be black and asleep. The blacksmith stood in an odd relation to all of that, since he was among the last men allowed to keep a working fire going into the evening. And his was the most dangerous fire on the street. London had learned what fires could do. In 1199, the city's first mayor, Henry Fitzaylwin, brought in what may be the earliest building regulations in its records: stone party walls, tiled roofs, a push against thatch. 13 years on, in 1212, fire broke out in Southwark, and the accounts describe flames catching both ends of London Bridge while a crowd stood trapped in the middle. A chronicler writing 4 centuries afterward put the dead on the bridge alone at 3,000, in a city that maybe held 50,000 souls all told, and historians have squinted at that figure ever since. The nearer descriptions are terrible enough on their own, people leaping from the bridge into boats below, and the boats rolling over from the weight of them. However many actually died, the city kept the memory, and every fire rule for generations afterward was drafted by men who could still smell that day. A householder whose fire escaped could answer for the damage at law, and town households kept leather buckets and long fire hooks for dragging burning thatch off a roof before a whole row went up. Equipment the wards inspected, in the better-run towns like a militia's weapons. Now stand a forge inside that fear. A deliberate, permanent, bellows-fed fire, pushed up to white heat on purpose, inside a shed roofed like every other building on the street. A smith never simply banked his coals once a day like a housewife. His entire livelihood was driving fire hotter than anyone else in town would ever need, then hammering metal that sprayed burning scale across the floor in little orange arcs. At welding heat, iron throws sparks like a festival. Every neighbor knew it, every alderman knew it, and the only insurance policy the age could offer was distance. So the smithies drifted outward. In a village, the forge commonly stood at the end of the row of houses or off beside the green, close enough to reach, far enough to lose. In towns, the metal trades pooled into streets of their own. London still has an ironmonger lane. Partly that was ordinary guild clustering, Partly it was quarantine, fold in the smoke and the smell, plus a persistent suspicion we'll get to much later tonight, that the man at the anvil kept personal company with the devil, and you have the standing arrangement of the entire medieval trade, needed by absolutely everyone, kept politely but firmly at a distance. Town smiths poisoned the air around them by a second route too. Charcoal was the proper forge fuel, but charcoal was expensive, and by the 1200s, London's forges were burning sea coal, mineral coal shipped down the coast from Newcastle, simply because it was cheap. Sea coal stank. It burned with a thick, sulphurous smoke that hung low in the streets and clung to laundry and lungs alike, and by the 1280s complaints about it were reaching the Crown. Commissions were struck to investigate the fumes, and around 1307 a royal proclamation tried to ban the burning of sea coal in the city's kilns entirely because of the stench. The smiths kept burning it anyway, quietly, since an occasional fine still cost less than charcoal. Walk past a metalworking street in 14th century London and you would have tasted the trade before you ever saw it. Sulphur at the back of the throat. And what did all that fire and smoke and hatred actually produce? Mostly not swords. The popular picture gets this completely wrong. A village smith spent almost none of his life on weapons. His bench was agricultural, horseshoes, and the nails to hold them, plough irons, the coulter and the share, the parts that actually bit into soil, sickles and scythes hammered back to an edge every season, hinges, hasps, latches, chain, harrow teeth, patches for cracked cauldrons, iron hoops for buckets, the metal fittings of carts. Iron was costly enough that most medieval tools were wood with an iron edge, and that edge was his responsibility. When the plough broke in spring, the field stood idle until his fire fixed it, and a whole village's bread that winter depended in some small measure on how fast he worked. Hunger sat quietly at the end of his bench all year round. Swordsmiths existed in the cities, serving men with money to spend on dying well. The man in the village shed was something else. The entire industrial base of a farming community, on his own, in the smoke. His forge was also, oddly, the warmest and most sociable room for a mile. On winter evenings, men drifted in to stand near the fire, trade news, watch the work, and get in the way. The smith heard everything: who was feuding, who was selling, whose daughter was marrying whom, a sort of confessor with a hammer, sweating through it all. And he sweated enormously. A man working a fire like that lost pints of water a day, and the drink of the age was ale, and the trade's thirst was proverbial long before those London spur makers turned drunk and frantic into a legal category. The picture of the smith with a mug never far from the anvil is old, and it was earned honestly, 1 gallon of sweat at a time. That community, the one warming itself at his fire, also handed him its sons. So the story properly starts where every smith started, as a small boy standing in someone else's forge, learning what the fire costs. In a village, the trade usually ran in the blood. A smith's son was in the shop as soon as he could walk without falling into the fire, and useful by 6. Fetching, carrying, sweeping scale off the floor, holding things. By 9 or 10, he was on the bellows. If you have never worked a great forge bellows, it is hard to convey what a miserable job that is for a child. The big double-chambered bellows were driven by a long bar or a chain, and the fire only stayed at working heat if the air came steadily, in a rhythm, hour upon hour. Too fast wastes fuel and burns the iron. Too slow and the heat dies and the master turns around. A boy stood at that bar through whole afternoons, arms burning, shoulders cramping, staring into a fire he was feeding but never allowed to touch. And the phrase in the poem about smiths blowing until their brains burst was written by a man watching that labor from across a lane. In the towns, the door into the trade was formal, and the paperwork survives in quantity. A boy was apprenticed somewhere between the ages of 7 and 13 or 14. His parents paid the master a premium for taking him. Training was a commodity like anything else, and the two parties drew up an indenture. The word itself is a physical description. The agreement was written out twice on one sheet, then the sheet was cut apart down the middle in a wavy, toothed line, indented like a bite mark, so that in any future dispute, the two halves could be matched, edge to edge, and proven genuine. One half went home with the parents, the other stayed with the master along with the boy. The terms were not gentle. The apprentice swore to serve faithfully, keep his master's secrets, and obey his lawful commands. He swore off taverns, dice, fornication, and marriage without his master's leave. The contracts spell all of it out. He was not to absent himself by day or by night. In exchange, the master owed him bed, board, clothing, and instruction in the craft, sometimes with a line about basic schooling. The standard term was 7 years. Plenty ran longer, to age 21 or even 24. The boys bound for the longest terms on the thinnest promises were the boys nobody wanted. Orphans. Illegitimate sons. Stepchildren an inconvenient marriage had left over. Parish and family alike found it tidy to bind such a boy to a master for a decade or more, and a smith got a pair of growing arms for the price of pottage and a straw mattress. Whatever money an apprentice earned or was given during his term belonged in law to his master. Every penny. For 7 years minimum, a boy in that shop owned nothing, went nowhere without leave, and answered with his body for every mistake. Because discipline, in that world, meant beating, and the law was comfortable with it. A master stood toward his apprentice roughly as a father stood toward a son, with what the age called the right of reasonable chastisement, and reasonable covered a great deal of ground. The guilds themselves flogged. Company records from the London livery halls note apprentices whipped at the hall for offences against their masters. One entry from just past our period records a cutler's apprentice whipped for beating his master and pilfering, the punishment administered before the assembled company as an example. Courts only took an interest in a master's violence when it crossed from correction into maiming or killing, and cases of exactly that made it into the records of London's mayor and coroners across the 14th century, masters answering for apprentices who had died under their hands. The bar for intervening sat about there, below death or mutilation, A beaten boy had almost nowhere to take a complaint that would be heard. Now set that boy's daily existence inside a forge specifically. He slept in the shop or above it, often under the bench, in air that never lost the taste of charcoal. He rose first, before light, to wake the fire, coaxing the banked coals with kindling and gentle strokes of the bellows until the heart of the hearth glowed again. Then the day's fetching, water for the slack tub, sacks of charcoal that blackened him to the elbows and ground dust into every crease of his skin, clinker and ash raked out and carried off. His hands blistered, then split, then calloused into something like hoof. His first burns came fast, and they were treated as tuition. A flake of glowing scale down the shoe, a cinder settling on the back of a wrist while both hands were occupied and could not slap it away. Learning where you may stand in a forge and where you may never stand is a lesson written on children's skin, and it was written on all of them. His first real work was nails. Nail making was the bottom rung of the whole trade, endlessly repetitive and perfect for training a hammer arm. Cut a length off the rod, point it with 4 quick strokes, drop it through the hole of a nail header, upset the top into a head with 2 more, knock it free, start over. A competent boy made hundreds in a day. A grown nailsmith made them by the 1,000, and armies bought them by the barrel. A single manor could swallow thousands of nails in a season, roofing, fencing, carts. So the boy at the header, small as his work looked, was hammering out a measurable share of the village's grip on itself. And everyone taught the same 2 things: hammer control and respect for the material. Iron was expensive. Scrap was hoarded and welded back into use. A boy who burned a bar in the fire through inattention or split it through clumsiness had destroyed something with real money value, and in that shop, with that law, the consequence generally arrived through the master's arm. If he survived the term, and I use survived deliberately, he came out the other side a journeyman, from the French word for a day's work, a man paid by the day. Now he could earn a wage and marry, and many spent years tramping between towns for work before they could ever dream of a shop of their own. Rising to master meant satisfying a guild, producing a masterpiece to prove his skill, paying the fees, finding the capital for premises, an anvil, tools, stock. Guilds kept the ladder deliberately narrow, limiting each master to an apprentice or 2, throttled the future supply of rivals, and kept the trade's wages where the masters liked them. Some journeymen hammered for other men their whole lives and died as they had started, working someone else's fire. Not every boy stayed to finish either. Apprentices ran, often enough that the system had worn grooves for dealing with it. Flight was breach of covenant. The hue could be raised, descriptions circulated, and a recovered runaway came back to the same master, with extra years sewn onto his term as penalty, plus whatever the master's arm added off the record. A boy who got clean away, with no papers and no completed term, could never work openly in a guild town, so runaways drained into the grey world of the roads, and the roads had metal workers of their own already. Itinerant tinkers and wandering smiths tramped village to village, mending pots, kettles, and small ironmongery, and the settled trade despised them from a great height. Guilds prosecuted them for working without license. Towns eyed them as vagrants and probable thieves, and honest folk locked things up when the mending man came through. The trade's hierarchy was merciless about it. The settled master at the top with his mark, his hall and his pew, the journeyman below him, and at the very bottom the man with a sack of tools and no parish, welcome for exactly as long as the soldering took. The folklore at the end of tonight has something genuinely cruel to say about that lowest rung. The master's own household, meanwhile, lived inside the trade in the most literal sense. Home was above the shop or through the wall from it, and the whole family breathed the forge. The wife commonly ran the money side, sales at the door, and the chasing of debts, on top of every other labour of a medieval household, and pitched in at the bellows or the nail bench when hands were short. Children were born into the smoke and raised in it. Infants slept through hammering because they had never known silence, and the racket that drove our Norwich writer to poetry was one lane over, simply the sound of somebody's father working. The trade did not stop at the smith's skin. It ran through the whole house, ate the whole family's air, and collected, in time, from every one of them. The world around all this, I should say, was casually violent to a degree that takes adjusting to. We know that because of a wonderful, horrible class of document, the coroner's rolls. When anyone in medieval London died suddenly or unnaturally, the coroner came, viewed the body where it lay, and summoned a jury of the neighbourhood, sometimes a dozen men and sometimes 50, to swear to what had happened. Their verdicts were enrolled, and a run of them survives for London across the 1300s. Researchers at Cambridge have mapped the homicides from those rolls street by street, and the picture is of lethal violence woven into completely ordinary life. A man beaten to death in a quarrel over eel skins dumped in the street, men stabbed over a game of backgammon, brawls between apprentices of rival trades that ended with someone bleeding out in a gutter, roughly 8 in every 100 victims, and about the same share of killers, were adolescents or children, and several are named in the rolls precisely as apprentices. Nearly every man carried a knife as a matter of course. Honour was defended on the spot, and arguments went from words to steel with almost no intermediate stage. A smithy sat inside that culture, holding a special inventory. Hammers of every weight, iron bar stock, tongs, files and half-finished blades, all within reach of tired, hot, crowded young men. The rolls suggest what you would expect, and when the day itself began, it began early and ended late. Working hours in the towns generally ran from dawn to the curfew bell, adjusted by season, so a summer day could stretch past 14 hours of light. Winter had its own cruelty. A smith lit his fire in full dark and worked the first hour by its glow, breath steaming, feet numbing on a packed earth floor, and the great block of his anvil holding the night's frost so stubbornly that cold iron laid on a cold face lost its working heat in moments. Some smiths warmed the anvil face with a heated bar before starting. Then, by August, the same shed became an oven no sane person would stand in, and he stood in it all day, 2 feet from a fire running above 1,000 degrees, in a leather apron, hammering. Everything so far has been context. The real subject of tonight is meat and bone, the body itself, and what the trade did to it. Start with heat. Iron forges at a bright orange, around 1,000 degrees or a little over. Fire welding, joining 2 pieces into one, the operation our Norwich poet watched the master perform, needs white heat, 12 to 1,300 degrees, right at the edge of burning the metal itself. At that temperature, the iron does not merely glow, it sparkles, throwing off burning droplets of oxide that land where they land. On the floor, on the apron, on the forearms, where they stick to skin for the instant it takes to smell yourself cooking. A smell every smith knew, and none of them ever mentions in any source, presumably as fishermen never mention brine. The bull-hide aprons and the armored shins in the poem existed for exactly this. Hands, though, mostly stayed bare. Gloves deadened the feel of the work, and the trade ran on feel, so the compromise across the centuries was skin, and the skin paid. A working smith's forearms carried dozens of small, healed white and pink burn marks, a private record of every session at welding heat. The really vicious burns came from a different direction. From iron that no longer looked hot. Metal glows red at around 500 degrees and above. Below that, it looks exactly like cold iron while holding enough heat to destroy a hand. Every forge had bars in that state lying about, pieces set down minutes before, waiting. Grabbing black hot iron was the classic catastrophic mistake, made by the tired and the momentarily distracted, and it was uniquely cruel in its mechanics, since the hand's grip reflex clamps down before the pain arrives. By the time the fingers open, the palm has branded itself onto the bar. Skin comes away, staying on the metal. What that left, in a world we'll get to shortly, was a deep burn across the working surface of a working man's hand, and deep burns do a specific thing as they heal. The scar tissue contracts. It shortens and tightens over months, pulling the fingers into a curl the man cannot straighten. And a hand curled by scar cannot hold a hammer or work tongs. Men lost the trade that way, without ever losing the hand. Eyes went next, and they went in 2 different ways, one fast and one slow. The fast way was mechanical. Hot iron under the hammer sheds its skin, the grey-black oxide scale. And the blows send slivers of it snapping off in every direction at speed. Nothing stood between those slivers and a smith's face. A fragment in the eye might wash out with luck, or it might embed in the cornea, and iron in the eye rusts, staining a ring into the living tissue around it, and every blink drags the lid across the buried splinter. Digging it out meant someone's fingernail, a knife point, or a needle, by lamplight, with the patient's head clamped under an arm. Infection afterward could take the eye entirely. The one-eyed smith was a recognizable figure, common enough to be unremarkable, and the slow way was the fire itself. Decades of staring into forge glow pours infrared into the lens of the eye, and the lens clouds. Centuries later, when physicians finally studied the chainmakers and forge workers of the industrial age, they found this exact cataract so consistently that it earned occupational names. A medieval smith in his 50s, if he reached his 50s, was often working through fog, judging his heats by memory and by the color he could still half see, drifting toward a blindness with only one occupation at the bottom of it: begging. The ears kept their own account. An anvil rings, struck steel on iron, at a distance of 2 feet, thousands of blows a day, every working day, from childhood. The trade was a hearing loss machine, and it took the high frequencies first, the range where speech lives, so that a smith in middle age heard voices as mumbling under a permanent whistle. Deaf as a smith was a phrase people understood. The whistle is tinnitus, and the miserable truth about tinnitus is that it follows a man to bed. The Norwich poet lay awake hating a noise that stopped at dawn. The smiths he hated lay in their own beds afterward, listening to a ringing that never stopped at all. Further down the body, the anvil itself did quiet damage. A serious anvil weighed 100 pounds and up, and it got moved into the shop, onto its block, occasionally to a job. Charcoal came in sacks a man carried on his back. Iron came in bars and blooms. The lifting, decade after decade, tore men open from the inside, and a rupture, a hernia, in that world was a life sentence. Surgery for it existed only in the most desperate and butcherous forms, so the standard management was a truss, a leather and metal harness pressing the bulge back into the wall of the belly, worn for the rest of a working life spent doing exactly the lifting that had caused it. And a hernia carries a trap door. If the loop of gut trapped in the gap twists and strangles, its blood supply dies, the bowel begins to rot inside the living man, and he dies over a few days, in spectacular pain, of an injury he had been hauling around for years. No record tells us how many smiths went that way. The trade description tells us some did. Elbows and wrists wore out in their own fashion, the hammer arm's tendons inflaming where they anchor at the elbow, an ailment so faithful to the trade that centuries of physicians have called that exact complaint blacksmith's elbow. The knees and the spine took the standing 12 and 14 hours a day on the beaten floor. Almost none of this was disabling on any single day. It just accumulated, layer on layer, until a man of 45 moved like a man of 70. Even the quench, that hiss the poet cursed, had its own strange corner of the trade's law, and this is one of my favorite, genuinely documented details in the whole subject. A monk who wrote under the name Theophilus put together a craft manual in the early 1100s called On Divers Arts, a workshop floor guide to metalwork, glass and painting, and when he comes to hardening steel files, he gives his recipe in complete seriousness. Quench them in the urine of a small red-headed boy, or, failing that, in the urine of a goat that has been fed on ferns for 3 days. He was not joking, and the strangest part is that the chemistry half works. Urine-quenching bathes hot steel in nitrogen compounds and can genuinely affect the hardening. Workshops full of men who understood results without understanding causes built recipes like that and guarded them like scripture, and darker recipes circulated as legend. Treatises and travellers' tales from the East whispered of master bladesmiths who brought a sword to heat and quenched it through the body of a slave, the living quench supposedly granting the steel some quality no water could. Whether any smith anywhere ever actually did it, the story was told, and it was told between smiths around fires as the sort of thing the greatest of them might do. The trade told that story about itself and maybe believed steel wanted it. Now for what happened when the fire or the hammer or the horse finally connected. Medicine. This stretch is grim even by the standards of what you've already heard. The care available depended entirely on where you stood. A town smith had access to barber surgeons, men of the razor and the lancet, who pulled teeth, let blood, lanced boils, set bones, and amputated, learning by doing. Physicians, the university men, existed for the rich and mostly would not touch a wound with their own hands anyway. A village smith had the local healer, the wise woman with her herbs, or nobody. And in a bleak little irony, in many villages the closest thing to a surgeon was the smith himself. He was the man with pincers, strong hands, and experience cutting into living animals. So by long tradition, it was the smith who pulled the village's rotten teeth, bracing a farmer's head against his chest and drawing a molar with the same tongs that held horseshoes. When the smith himself was the patient, the roles had to shuffle awkwardly. Whoever treated a wound, the theory guiding them was actively harmful. Learned surgery in the period largely held that a certain sort of pus was a healthy and necessary stage of healing. Laudable pus, the texts call it, and so wounds that a modern medic would seal and guard against infection were instead kept open, packed with lint, probed, and encouraged to suppurate. The probing was done with fingers and instruments washed, if at all, in water no cleaner than the patient. Some traditional wound dressings, in fairness, did real good. Honey, which genuinely fights bacteria, went onto wounds and burns and had for millennia, but the overall system took a filthy injury and managed it toward infection with method and confidence. So look at what a trivial forge injury could become. Day 1. A splinter of scale, or the bird edge of a bar, opens the back of a smith's knuckle. He wraps a rag around it and works. Day 3. The edges of the cut have gone angry and shiny, the hand is hot and tight, and closing it around a hammer wakes him up properly. Day 4. Thin red streaks are climbing the inside of his forearm, following the vessels toward the elbow, and the glands in his armpit have swollen into hard pebbles that hurt when his arm brushes his side. That night, the fever arrives, with rigors, shaking chills violent enough to rattle a bed frame. Day 5 or 6. He is delirious, talking to his dead mother, soaked through, his heart hammering like his own shop. Day 7, or thereabouts. Dead. Blood poisoning, we would say. Sepsis. The age had no name that helped and no remedy that touched it. A man in his prime, the strongest pair of arms in the village, killed in a week by a scratch. And the awful part is how ordinary that story was. Nobody would have written it down. It was just how people died. The smithy kept one horror all its own: tetanus. The bacterium behind it lives in soil and thrives in the manure of horses, and now consider the floor of a forge that shoes horses. Packed earth, worked over daily by animals, littered with iron slivers and dropped nails. A puncture, a nail through the sole of a shoe, a splinter driven deep under the skin, a hoof-trimming knife slipping into the base of a thumb, carries the contamination down into the airless depth of the wound, exactly where this organism likes to work. What follows, over days, was known to the age as lockjaw, and the medieval descriptions match the modern ones because the disease has never changed. First, the jaw stiffens, chewing aches, the neck goes wooden. Then the muscles of the face contract into a fixed, mirthless grin the old physicians named the sardonic smile. The dying man appears to be grinning at you and cannot stop. Then come the spasms. The body's muscles, all of them, fire at once and against each other, arching the back so violently that a man may touch the bed only with his heels and the back of his skull, in a bow of rigid muscle, strong enough to tear the muscles themselves, and, in the worst seizures, to crack the spine from the inside. Any small shock sets a spasm off. A slammed door, a shout, a light carried into the room, so the family learns to move around the dying man in silence and darkness. And through every hour of it, his mind stays perfectly clear. The disease does not touch consciousness. He is present and aware, locked inside a body clenching itself to death, until the spasms take the muscles of his chest and throat, and he suffocates, sometimes days in. Medieval medicine could do precisely nothing beyond restraint and prayer. For a trade standing all day on soil soaked in horse manure, handling sharp iron, this was not an exotic fate. It was one of the standing risks of the floor itself. Burns kept their own grim ledger. A small burn scarred and was forgotten. A large one covering the hand and forearm, say, from a spilled crucible or a fall against the forge, killed in ways the age could see but never explain. The burned man might seem to rally for a day or two and then sink, the body weeping fluid through the destroyed skin faster than drinking could replace it, the collapse we now call shock. And then, for those who cleared even that, the vast open wound stood as an unlocked door for every infection just described. The dressings were lard, egg white, and honey. The honey, as I said, honestly helping, changed by hands that had been in the stable an hour before. And a healed big burn was itself a sentence, contracting as it closed, welding chin to chest, or fingers to palm, remodeling a man into a shape the trade had no use for. Then the crush injuries, and the accident only makes sense once you see how heavy forging actually worked. Big work. An anchor, a large axle, thick bar, was a two-man job at minimum. The master held and turned the piece with tongs and touched his light hammer where he wanted the blow. The striker, often the journeyman or a strong apprentice, swung the sledge, 10 and 12 pounds of it, in full arcs, landing exactly where the master's hammer had tapped. It is a beautiful rhythm to watch, and it is target practice conducted at full power beside another man's hands, hour after hour, by tired people. One mistimed swing, one slip of sweat-slick hickory, and the sledge lands not on glowing iron, but on the master's hand against the anvil, and an anvil gives nothing back. Fingers burst. That is the honest verb. Flesh splits and bone shatters into fragments that no medieval splinting could reassemble, and now the man faces the plain reality of the barber-surgeon's bench. A hand too destroyed to heal, certain to rot if left, and one procedure on offer. Amputation, in the medieval version, went like this. Anesthesia did not exist in any reliable form. Wine, taken in quantity. Sometimes a soporific sponge, a rag soaked in opium, henbane and mandrake held to the nose, appears in the texts, and it worked unpredictably when it worked at all, and occasionally it simply killed the patient before the knife could, since the difference between a dose that stupefies and a dose that stops breath was unknown and unknowable. In practice, the anesthetic was 4 strong men. They held the patient, one to each limb, or folded over him bodily, while the surgeon took a curved knife around the limb down to the bone, cutting through skin, fat and muscle in a few strokes, and then took the saw. A capable surgeon was through the bone in well under a minute, and speed was the entire mercy on offer. The good ones were proud of their speed, and patients chose surgeons on it. Then the stump had to be stopped from bleeding a man dry in minutes, and the options were all terrible. Ligature, tying off the vessels with thread, was known but slow and treacherous, the ties slipping loose hours later. So the common resort was fire. The cautery iron, heated in a brazier that stood ready beside the bench, pressed onto the raw stump to sear the vessels shut. A smith, if the patient was a smith, being finished with the exact tool of his own trade, conscious, held down, in a room filling with a smell he knew better than anyone in it. Or boiling oil, poured onto the same purpose. Survival, all told, was a coin flip, weighted by luck, location, and the surgeon's speed. And worse, the higher up the limb the saw had to go. And surviving delivered a man into the problem the whole trade lived downstream of. A right-handed smith without a right hand has no trade. Nothing he knows transfers. If his guild was in a generous season and his dues were paid, a small pension or alms might come from the company box, and a master might keep a maimed man on at the bellows or minding the fire, half wage, half charity. Far more had no guild or no standing, and for them the trajectory was the church door and the wooden bowl. a man who had shod war horses and forged plough irons, begging from the people whose tools he had made, his stump wrapped in the leather of his old apron. Medieval towns were full of exactly such men, from every trade that used edges and fire, and the records of charity are full of them too, right at the bottom. One thing the trade could genuinely do for its maimed, it could build for them. Hooks, iron sockets, wooden legs bound in forged strapwork, crutches shod with iron ferrules so they wouldn't split on cobbles. The same benches that made the tools could replace, crudely, the hands the tools had taken, and a smith fitting an iron socket to a fellow smith's stump was doing recognizable work, measuring and shaping for a comfortable seat, the craft it had always been, aimed at a sadder target. Just past our period, the German knight Gotz von Berlichingen lost his right hand to a shot in 1504 and had armourers, smiths at the summit of the art, build him an articulated iron hand with fingers that locked in position, good enough to grip reins, and, he maintained, a sword, and he campaigned with it for decades. Village versions were humbler, a hook and a leather cup, but the principle ran the whole ladder. The trade wounded men, and then ironworked them back into partial motion. One more thing waits in the surgeon's world, gangrene, and then we climb out of the surgery. When a crushed or burned limb was left too long, out of fear, poverty, or distance from anyone with a saw, the tissue died in place. It blackens from the extremity upward. It swells and then collapses. The smell is famous in every century's medical writing, sweetish and foul, and it fills a house. Sometimes flies found the wound, and maggots did what maggots do, and medieval healers noticed, as army surgeons would notice for centuries after, that the wounds maggots cleaned often did better than the wounds they never reached, since the larvae eat only dead flesh and scour it to the living line. Either way, the man and everyone around him could watch death climbing him by the day, a tide line moving up the limb, and the only question was whether the saw would be brought in above the line in time, and whether he would survive the saw. Some refused it, and their families sat with the smell and waited. Those who dodged every acute ending got the slow one instead. And with that, we move from the sudden deaths to the gradual one, the trade's quietest killer, the lungs. A forge burns charcoal, and charcoal smoke is a fog of fine carbon, and to it the work adds a dust of metal, scale ground underfoot to powder, filings from the bench. The invisible spray of oxide off hammered iron. In summer, with the shop open, much of it escaped. In an English winter, the smith worked in a shed shut tight against the cold, over a fire, in his own cloud, 12 hours a day, from boyhood to death. His spit was black. That was simply a fact of the trade, remarked no more than sooty hands. And year by year, the carbon load built up in the fine architecture of the lungs, blackening the tissue. Physicians opening such chests centuries later found lungs the color of the coal sack, stiffening it, choking the exchange of air until the man had a permanent cough, then a permanent wheeze, then a chest that whistled climbing a stair. The pattern takes roughly 10 to 20 years of exposure to establish itself, and the trade's whole span was exposure. So the smith who avoided the sepsis, the tetanus, the sledge, the horse, and the fire got to spend his 50s suffocating slowly next to the thing that had fed his family, dying by inches of the 10,000 fires he had raised. All of that damage should, you'd think, still be visible. And this is where the archaeology comes in, so bear with me through a short stretch of bones. The bones are where the trade's cost stops being anecdote and becomes something you can hold. When people dig up medieval cemeteries, the skeletons of working folk are wrecked in consistent ways. A study of around 400 skeletons from 7 excavations in the west of England, Saxon through medieval, found osteoarthritis and its bony outgrowths at rates that surprised the researchers, worn joints everywhere they looked. At Christ Church Spitalfields in London, the shoulders, the spine and the hands turned out to be the most damaged sites, with men worse off than women. Bioarchaeologists also study a subtler marker, the entheses, the anchor points where tendons and ligaments grip the bone, and under decades of heavy repetitive loading, those anchor points coarsen and remodel, leaving a legible roughness on the skeleton. The best medieval work on this comes from Mikułczyce, a 9th century fortress town in what's now the Czech Republic, where researchers scored those attachment sites across nearly 200 skeletons and found changes in 3/4 of the people who had died before 50, with the labouring men of the surrounding countryside marked worst of all. The same populations show a pronounced right-side dominance in the arm bones, the muscle anchors of the right shoulder and upper arm built up beyond the left. A lifetime swinging something does that to a skeleton. Now, the honest caveat, delivered once and then we move on. None of those studied skeletons comes with a sign saying Blacksmith. Joint damage and roughened entheses come from age and inheritance as well as from labour, so no researcher will point to one lesion and say hammer. And the one grave in England everyone would love to interrogate refuses to answer. In 1981, at Tattershall Thorpe in Lincolnshire, excavators opened a solitary grave from the mid to late 600s, and out of it came the most complete smith's kit ever found from Anglo-Saxon England. More than 130 iron objects, an anvil, hammerheads, tongs, snips, files, punches, a draw plate for pulling wire, knife blades, balance pans for weighing, scrap metal put by for reworking, old Roman coins, garnets and glass for fine work, and bells, a working life laid in the earth at both ends of a body. Of the man himself, the acid fen soil had left almost nothing, a few crumbs of bone, too little to age or measure. So the one certain smith is the one skeleton missing, and the picture of the trade's toll has to be assembled sideways from the wrecked joints of the anonymous labouring dead all around him, whose bodies his almost certainly resembled. His grave says other things, though. It sat alone, Out on the edge of the fen, away from any known settlement or cemetery, one man and his tools in the wet margin of the world. The archaeologist who published the find suggested a smith attached to some royal estate nearby, valued for his skill and yet buried like a man the community wanted at a certain distance even in death. And those bells in the grave invite thoughts. Bells hung at a forge could announce a stranger's approach across open country. Bells in folklore do other work, against other visitors, and the burial of the entire toolkit is its own puzzle. Tools were wealth. An anvil was a fortune. Putting it all in the ground was either enormous honor or something more uneasy. A sense, maybe, that a dead smith's tools were better sealed in the earth with him than passed into other hands. The grave doesn't say. It just sits there at the edge with its bells. Scandinavia gives us the same picture with better furniture. In 2015, a farmer named Leif Arne Nordheim at Sogndal on a Norwegian fjord lifted some flagstones in his garden looking for better drainage and found iron under them. And the museum in Bergen excavated an early Viking Age smith's grave from around 800, roughly 60 objects, arranged in deliberate layers. On top, the personal man, a razor, beard scissors, tweezers, a frying pan, a poker. Beneath that, the armed man, a single-edged sword, an axe, arrows, a knife, and at the bottom, underneath everything, the trade. 3 hammers of different weights, 2 anvils, blacksmith's tongs and coal tongs, a coal rake, a chisel, a drill, a sickle and scythe, whetstone fragments, nails. Below it all, ash, charcoal, and small crumbs of cremated human bone. Somebody stood at that graveside and stacked a man's existence in order, and they put the smithing at the foundation, under the weapons, under the grooming kit, holding everything else up. Then, for 11 centuries, the fjord got on with things above him. The strangest of the set comes last, the Mastermere chest from the island of Gotland. A wooden toolbox hauled out of a drained bog, packed with a master metalworker's full kit, hammers, tongs, saws, files, shears, with a chain wrapped around the box and its owner missing from the story entirely. The most precious portable thing a craftsman owned, lost or hidden in a mire around 1,000 years ago, wrapped up as if he absolutely meant to come back for it. And he never came back. From the graveyard then to the account books and the question of what all this suffering actually paid, short answer, enough to live, never enough to be safe. A skilled town smith might take 3 to 5 pence a day when work came. For scale, the wage tables from the mid-1300s give a master mason 4 pence a day and a master carpenter 3, while a plain labourer scraped along on a penny or 2. So the smith sat comfortably above the field hand and nowhere near comfort itself, and his overheads ate at him constantly. Iron was dear, charcoal was dear, and behind the charcoal stood a whole other doomed trade, the colliers, who lived out in the woods for weeks tending slow, smouldering, earth-covered mounds that had to be watched day and night, and who sometimes died at their own kilns, smothered by the fumes when they dozed too close, or dropped through the crust of a burning heap they had walked across one time too many. The smith's fire consumed their labour by the sack, and his margins with it. The village smith often wasn't fully his own man anyway. His smithy was frequently counted among the manor's assets, like the mill and the bakehouse and the well, and his craft came bound up with obligations to the Lord, service owed, rent owed, the manorial court standing by with its fines for work neglected or duties missed, and a holding that could be forfeited entirely. How old is that arrangement? Old enough to be startling. The laws of King Ian of Wessex, set down around 694, allow a nobleman moving to a new estate to take certain people with him, and the law names them, his reeve, his smith, and his children's nurse. A man of fire and iron, listed in the 7th century small print between the estate manager and the nanny, as household property that travels with the household. The trade spent centuries attached to other men's land and other men's wars, and the law never pretended otherwise. Within the towns, the guild squeezed from the other side. Fines for bad work, fines for working past hours, wardens with the right to search a shop and break substandard goods on the spot, prices fixed, apprentice numbers capped. And when a smith's body finally failed, the whole structure revealed its flaw. No pension existed anywhere in the world. A guild in good humour might grant alms to a broken member who had paid his dues for decades. A lord might, or might not, feel some obligation to a manor smith too wrecked to work. And beyond those thin ledges waited the parish, and beyond the parish, the road. The old smith at the end of the trade, in the average case, was a man with fused knuckles and a curled, burn-scarred hand, half-deaf, coughing black, squinting through clouding eyes, owning a set of tools he could no longer lift, and the tools were the pension, sold or passed to a son, and after that came whatever charity was going. His widow, oddly, sometimes had firmer footing than he did, and one documented Englishwoman deserves her moment here. Custom in many towns allowed a craftsman's widow to carry on his shop, keep his apprentices, and finish his contracts. And the Crown's own records show it happening at the very top of the trade. At the Tower of London, the king kept a forge, and in 1346 the royal smith working it died, and the position passed to his widow, Catherine. She kept the king's forge through the year of the Creasy campaign, the administration's clerks recording her pay at the same daily rate as her husband, while that forge turned out ironwork and horseshoes for a war in France, and horseshoes for a campaign were counted in the thousands. A woman running the King of England's smithy in wartime on a man's wages sits right there in the accounts, unremarked, which suggests the clerks didn't find it remarkable. Down at the village level, wives and daughters had always worked the trade's edges, the bellows, the nail bench, invisible to records that only name the master. The trade ate their bodies too. Nobody was measuring. Horses now. I've been circling them all night. The horse may have been the single most dangerous colleague a smith ever had. Shoeing is intimate work with an animal that weighs half a ton, does not enjoy the process, and kills without meaning to. The farrier folds the horse's leg up, grips the hoof between his knees, and puts his skull at hip height beside the animal's hindquarters, closer to the kick than any other human being ever voluntarily stands. Hot shoeing sets the glowing shoe momentarily against the hoof to check the fit, and the horn burns with a thick, acrid smoke that rolls up into the horse's face and the man's alike. An unbothered horse tolerates it, a green or frightened one explodes. Drive one nail a fraction too deep into the quick, the living part of the foot, and the explosion comes without notice. A shod hoof arrives at the speed of a swung sledge with the mass of the animal behind it, and coroners of every century have written the same verdicts: the skull staved in, the chest crushed, the artery over the heart ruptured by a single kick, dead before anyone could cross the yard. Medieval inquest juries treated death by horse as a standing category of misadventure, one of the ordinary ways a person's story ended, and the man whose trade held him beside the hindquarters of strange horses 6 days a week collected that risk with every animal walked to his door. Every smith who shod for a living had been kicked. The only question was where and how hard, and whether the day it landed square was the day that finished him. Farriers answered the danger with technique and superstition in equal measure. A twist of the upper lip to distract the animal, a helper leaning hard into the flank, a quiet word repeated like a charm, and every trick failed eventually, on some horse, on some ordinary afternoon. Before the crown and the folklore get their turn, spare a little daylight for the iron itself. Nobody handed a medieval smith a clean, ready bar of metal. Somebody had to make the metal, and making it was its own circle of labour. Much of England's iron began as bog ore, rusty lumps and crusts gathered out of marshes, stream beds and heathland, dug and dredged by hand and hauled in baskets. The ore was roasted, broken small, and charged into a bloomery, a clay shaft furnace, chest high, packed in careful layers with charcoal. And then the bellows work began and continued for the better part of a day. A bloomery never gets hot enough to melt iron outright, so down in the glowing heart of the furnace a bloom slowly forms instead. A spongy, glowing, half-fused mass of iron and slag about the size of a loaf, and when the furnace was broken open, that incandescent sponge was dragged out with tongs into the night air, spitting, and the consolidation began. Sledgehammers in relays driving the slag out of the sponge in showers of white sparks with every blow, welding the honeycomb of metal into a solid billet. Hours of the heaviest hammerwork in the entire iron trade, spent before a single usable object existed. Smelting a few pounds of iron devoured charcoal by the sackload, and every sack traced back to those colliers in the woods with their smouldering mounds. Follow one finished horseshoe backward, and the chain of labour runs through the farrier, the smith, the smelting crew, the ore diggers, and the charcoal burners, most of them coughing, all of them scarred, and the shoe still cost only a few pence at the end of it. That is why iron was treated like money. Old horseshoes went back into the fire, broken tools were forge-welded into new ones. A bar might live 5 or 6 lives in different shapes across 50 years, and a smith counted his scrap like a miser counting coins. Functionally, that is what it was. At the top of the trade, in the cities, sat the bladesmiths, and even they answered for their work with the closest thing to a name most of them had. A good sword cost more than most labourers earned in months, and the finest work of earlier centuries, pattern-welded blades built by twisting and welding rods of different irons into serpentine-watered patterns, represented weeks of exactly the skills our poet heard practiced at midnight, layered into a single object a rich man would wear more often than use. City guilds required makers to strike a touch mark into their work, a small punch device unique to the shop, and the mark cut both ways. It advertised the maker, and it convicted him. A cracked helmet or a failed blade could be traced by its mark straight back to one bench, and the fines and shame followed the mark home. For men who could not write, that little punched symbol was signature and legal liability compressed into a quarter-inch of steel, very often the only mark a smith ever left on the world in his own hand. And archaeologists still catalogue them, tiny stamps of men with no other name. Down in the villages, meanwhile, the smith's money was often barely money at all. Much of his year ran on credit and kind. The plough he mended in March might be paid for at harvest, in grain, in a flitch of bacon, in a day's carting, the debts kept on notched tally sticks, and in everyone's memory. And the whole system leaned on one assumption, that the harvest would come in. When it did, the smith ate. When it failed, every debt owed to him failed with it, while his own costs, the iron and the charcoal, stayed brutally real. He was a creditor of the whole village, and the whole village's luck was his bank. England found out exactly what that meant at the start of the 14th century, a generation before the plague, in a disaster the plague has almost completely overshadowed. Beginning in 1315, the rains came and essentially did not stop. The harvest of 1315 drowned in the fields. The harvest of 1316 failed on top of it, and the years after limped from bad to worse, with a cattle plague arriving in the early 1320s to kill the oxen that pulled the ploughs the smiths maintained. Grain prices multiplied several times over. Chroniclers across northern Europe recorded people eating their seed corn, then the dogs, then bark and grass, and passed along darker whispers about what starving people did. In the worst-hit regions, something like 1 person in 10 died over those years. A slow, grinding famine mortality, hunger and the diseases that ride on hunger, stretched across most of a decade. And for a trade like smithing, famine had a particular cruelty. Iron is the first spending a starving household stops. Nobody commissions hinges while the children are hungry. The plough still had to work. That repair got paid somehow. But the rest of the bench went quiet, the tallies filled with debts that would never be honoured, and the strongest man in the village stood in a fully equipped forge, tools in hand, skills intact, and went hungry at the same pace as everyone else, because you cannot eat capability. The generation of smiths who lived through the Great Famine as children were the masters who then faced the plague in their prime. The 14th century did not pace itself. Night in a medieval town killed quietly too, and the coroner's rolls preserve the pattern with grim regularity. After curfew, the streets were unlit and the town was full of open water, rivers without railings, wells without covers, ditches, tanning pits, mill ponds. and the verdicts of misadventure pile up along predictable lines. Found drowned, went out at night, had been drinking. Ale was food and drink at once, the working world's great social lubricant, and a hot trade swallowed more of it than most, and a man navigating home from the alehouse through absolute blackness toward the edge of town, where the forges stood, walked past most of the water on the way. The rolls record such deaths across every trade in numbers that startle modern eyes. One of the era's steadiest small harvests. A man could survive the forge for 30 years and finish face down in 4 feet of mill pond 100 paces from his own anvil, and the jury would view the body and say the word misadventure. English law even had machinery for blaming objects. The deodand, the thing that caused a death, forfeited to the crown to be given to God. So a cart, a cauldron, a well bucket, or in principle an anvil that killed a man, could itself be confiscated and valued. The era's way of impounding the murder weapon when the murderer was furniture. The guilds, for all their fines and floggings, offered one genuine consolation at the end of all this, and it mattered enormously to the people involved. Nobody died alone, and nobody was buried cheap. A craft guild was a burial society before it was almost anything else. Dues bought candles around the coffin, brothers of the trade to carry it, a proper grave, and the part the age valued above everything. Masses sung for the dead man's soul, sometimes for years, paid from the common box. Kneeling in church on Sunday, these particular men looked up at wall paintings of hell, where the demons carried hammers and tongs and worked sinners over flames, just like the ones waiting back at the shop. A smith spent his working life operating hell's own equipment on the parish's behalf, hearing the comparison in sermons and seeing it on the plaster, and the guild's promise that when his lungs finally quit, the whole trade would stand around his coffin and sing him past that furnace, was worth every farthing of the dues. Fear of dying unshriven and unremembered ran deeper in these communities than fear of dying full stop. The trade could not keep a man alive. It could promise him company at the door. Iron carried one further social power that outlived the entire Middle Ages, and you have probably heard its echo without the history attached. The forge carried an old association with binding, the smith being professionally the man who joins two things so they cannot be parted, and folk practice kept finding quasi-legal uses for that. Oaths were sworn on iron in parts of Ireland and Scotland, where an oath on iron bound as hard as one on a relic. And centuries later, when England tightened its marriage laws and runaway couples bolted north over the Scottish border, the first building in the first village became the wedding chapel of the English-speaking world. The blacksmith shop at Gretna Green, where so-called anvil priests, some of them actual smiths, married couples over the anvil by declaration, hammering down on the iron to seal it. That custom is well after our period, but the logic underneath it is pure medieval forge law. The man who welds metal can weld people, and a bond made over an anvil holds. Couples still get married at Gretna Green over an anvil today, most of them with no idea how far down that image goes. Take the whole year then, and watch the trade breathe with the seasons before we climb toward the crown and the myths. Late winter and spring were the plough months, the forge crowded with broken shares and coulters as the whole manor bore down on planting, the season when the smith's speed genuinely fed people. High summer brought the harvest edgework, scythes and sickles to draw out and hammer thin and true, mowers queuing at the door, tempers short because daylight was money. Autumn was slaughter and shoeing, the roads about to turn foul, every horse in the district needing sound feet before winter, salted meat going into barrels sealed with iron hoops. And deep winter, the season our poets suffered, was stockwork. Nails by the thousand, chain, repairs, the long dark hours when the forge glowed latest because the light was free and the demand never stopped. Some winters the smith fitted frost nails, sharpened studs set into horseshoes so animals could keep their feet on iced roads, hammering grip into a January morning while his own feet froze on the floor. Around that whole wheel of the year ran the same fire, the same lungs, the same shoulders, one man's body amortized across a community's entire relationship with metal. The church calendar punctuated the wheel, dozens of feast days a year on which servile work was forbidden, and a man could be fined for hammering on a saint's morning, enforced rest. The smith's purse resented and his shoulders quietly kneaded. And then the fire was lit again the next dawn, and the wheel turned, until the body gave out, and the next pair of shoulders, the son, the apprentice, the widow, stepped up to the anvil, usually within days, because the village could spare its smith for exactly as long as it could spare its bread. Skill with metal carried one more danger, and this one wore a crown. A man who could cut steel dies and strike clean impressions in metal was, from the state's point of view, standing one short step from the most jealously guarded machine in the kingdom, the coinage. Money was the king's face, literally, stamped in silver, and tampering with it was treated from very early on as an attack on the king himself. The Visigothic law codes of the 600s already ordered the right hand struck off men who forged coin, with torture prescribed for slaves suspected of knowing about it. Charlemagne, around 805, pulled all minting into his own palace at Thionville to keep the dies under his hand, and England, in the winter of 1124, produced the single most concentrated act of state violence against metalworkers in its history. The background is almost mundane. King Henry I was across the sea campaigning in Normandy, and his soldiers were furious because the silver pennies they were paid in were rubbish, clipped, debased, so poor that traders were refusing them. The moneyers of England, the licensed men who struck the coin in towns across the country, were blamed as a class. So orders went out, and at Christmas, the moneyers of England were summoned to Winchester. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records what happened when they got there, in the flat tone that Chronicle keeps for everything. One by one, over the days of the feast, they were taken, and each was deprived of his right hand and castrated. Hand off, on the block, then the other thing, and then out into a Winchester midwinter, a maimed man clutching a cauterized wrist while the next was brought in. A later source counts roughly 94 men mutilated out of about 150 summoned. Through the 12 days of Christmas, in the old capital of Wessex, working metal workers were processed like that in something close to industrial quantity, and the chronicler adds with no apparent irony that the mutilations were performed with great justice because the men had ruined the country with their bad money. Guilty or innocent, skilled hands and all. England's minting operation shrank from around 54 mints toward 21 in the years after, and the survivors walked their towns for the rest of their lives as one-handed, unmanned proclamations of what the king's coin was worth. The account books put a price on the fear too. The pipe roll of 1130, the Exchequer's annual accounts, carries an entry for a moneyer named Brand, who paid the crown £20 so that he would not be mutilated with the others. £20, an enormous sum, entered by a clerk in the same style as rents and fines, a man's right hand and his manhood converted into a line of accounting. Brand kept his hand. History does not record how he raised the money, or what it cost him in other ways, or how he stood in a room afterward with colleagues who hadn't been able to pay. And that was the merciful end of the scale, in a sense, because for common counterfeiters, coiners and clippers without a license and without £20, English practice through the later Middle Ages included boiling, a cauldron, a fire beneath, a crowd, and the condemned man lowered in the worst accounts lowered slowly, by stages. One detail is enough. Death in boiling water is not quick, and the crowd's memory of the sound was the point of holding the event in public. Any blacksmith who possessed the skill to cut a die and the poverty to be tempted knew what stood between him and that cauldron. One informer, one purse of bad pennies traced back to his bench. England staged a second mass demonstration of what happened when suspicion about the coin needed bodies, and it is among the ugliest episodes of the entire age. In 1278, Edward I ordered sweeping arrests over the clipping of coin, the shaving of slivers of silver from the edges of pennies, melted down for profit. Suspicion fell hardest, and by design, on England's Jewish community, barred from most trades and pushed into money-lending, and therefore permanently surrounded by silver and permanently convenient to blame. Hundreds were seized and held in the Tower of London, and the trials that ran through 1279 ended with mass hangings in London. The recorded figure for the Jewish community executed runs beyond 250 people, while Christians accused of the same offense walked away with pardons and fines far more often. 12 years afterward, the entire community was expelled from the kingdom. That belongs to a larger and even darker story than tonight's. But it sits inside this one too, because the logic was Winchester's logic over again. The coin is the king's body. Somebody must bleed for its condition, and the crown chose who bled by asking who was easiest to hang. Meanwhile, the same trade forged the state's entire toolkit of punishment, and the orders came through like any others. Shackles and fetters for the prisons, by weight. Chains. Branding irons, shaped into letters, for searing marks into the thumbs and cheeks of convicted men. The smith filing the serifs on a letter that would spend its working life in human skin. Cages of iron strap work for the gibbet, made to size around a hanged man's frame so the body could creak at a crossroads for years as an advertisement. Somebody made every one of those objects at a forge to a commission and got paid the same pence as for hinges. The trade sat on both sides of the law's violence at once, its instruments and, at Winchester, its raw material. The forge served the law in yet another capacity, older and stranger than any of that hardware. For centuries, when a court could not establish guilt by witnesses, English justice handed the question to God directly, and one of the standard instruments was the ordeal of hot iron. The accused fasted, heard mass, and then took up a bar of iron heated glowing in a brazier. Heated, note, by somebody who knew how to bring iron to an exact color, and carried it in a bare hand for 9 paces. The hand was then bound and sealed and unwrapped 3 days later before witnesses. Healing cleanly meant innocence, festering meant guilt, and the sentence followed. The records rarely say who worked the coals at the church door on ordeal days, but heating iron precisely was one profession's daily bread and nobody else's, and every smith in every parish carried, in his own scarred palms, a lifetime's private data on exactly what 3 days does to a burned hand, knowledge the judges lacked and the verdict depended on. The church pulled its clergy out of the business at the Lateran Council of 1215. The ordeals collapsed within a generation, and trial by jury moved into the vacancy, leaving the glowing bar to folklore, where the test of the burned hand has never entirely gone out. Kings counted smiths in peacetime among their granaries and war horses. In war, they simply took them. Charlemagne's capitulary of 802 orders his lords to keep metal workers on their lands, specifically so that mail and equipment could be produced. Smiths, as strategic infrastructure, counted like horses. Medieval armies moved with travelling forges, and the smiths went where the army went, whether or not the smiths had opinions about it. In a siege, the trade worked both sides of the wall, inside, hammering out arrowheads and repairing gates until the moment the wall failed. And when a city fell, the sack that followed had a sorting logic that appears in source after source. Fighting men were killed, the skilled were kept. No conqueror pushed that logic further than the Mongols, whose destructions of cities in the 1200s were near total, with one famous exception. Artisans, smiths and metal workers prominent among them were pulled out of the slaughter, counted and marched east into the empire's service. When the Friar William of Rubruck reached the Mongol capital at Karakorum in the 1250s, he found there a Parisian master metalworker, Guillaume Boucher, captured in the Hungarian campaigns around 1242, living as the Khan's craftsman a continent from home. Boucher built the court a great silver tree with 4 spouts that poured different drinks at a signal, a marvel travellers described for years. A free craftsman of Paris, picked up like a tool from a burning workshop, carried 5,000 miles and set to work. Proof, in one biography, that everything in the smith's world could be seized along with him. He was the asset. The hammer was just the handle. The sheer scale of what war demanded from the trade is easy to underestimate until you look at the procurement records. English armies of the 14th century devoured arrows. and the crown's clerks ordered arrowheads in the hundreds of thousands, sheaves by the cartload, gathered into the Tower of London, an arsenal that swallowed the output of smiths and specialist arrowsmiths across whole counties. Each head was a few minutes of skilled work at a small forge: cut the blank, draw the point, form and weld the socket, harden, done, next. A practiced arrowsmith turned out heads by the hundred in a day, week after week on contract at so much per hundred, and every one of those few minutes of work was designed to end inside a man or a horse. Excavated battlefields give the trade its bluntest memorial. Iron points by the basketful, sifted out of the plough soil, every single one hand-forged by somebody whose name went unrecorded even in the invoice. And the armies carried the trade bodily along with them. Muster rolls list smiths and farriers marching on campaign at soldiers' pay, portable forges rattling on carts in the baggage train, because a cavalry force threw shoes daily and siege machinery broke constantly. And so the smith did his same work in an army camp's mud, with dysentery for a neighbour, and the same fire in front of him, hammering from France to Scotland at the crown's pleasure. The North, by the way, told a story about exactly that man, the captive craftsman, centuries older and infinitely darker, and it arrives before the night is out. First, though, the devil. He has waited long enough. Medieval eyes looked at a forge and saw hell's front room. The parallels wrote themselves, the fire that never went out, the smoke, the blackened man wielding tongs, the hiss and the glow. And the wall paintings of doom in parish churches showed demons working sinners with hammers and pincers, tools every parishioner could see through the smithy door on any weekday. The smith commanded fire and transformed matter, and he did it at the edge of the village, at night, hammering into the dark. And a mind furnished by those wall paintings drew the obvious conclusion. Something about that man was not entirely on the parish's side of things. The stories agreed, and one of them may be the oldest story human beings still tell. Folklorists index it as the tale of the smith and the devil, and the skeleton is always the same. A smith strikes a bargain with the devil, his soul in exchange for supreme skill, often the specific power to weld any two things together, and then uses the gift to cheat the buyer, welding the devil himself to an anvil or a tree or a bench, and hammering until the terms are renegotiated. In 2016, 2 researchers published a study that treated folk tales like genes, tracing versions across the Indo-European language family, the way biologists trace mutations. And the smith and the devil traced back further than almost anything else in the sample, plausibly 6,000 years, to the Bronze Age, before Homer, before writing in the West, older than the pyramids. Some folklorists have pushed back, asking whether a word for smith even existed in the ancestor language, and the argument continues in the journals, as arguments should. But sit with the possibility. Of everything humanity has ever invented around a fire, the story with perhaps the deepest surviving roots is about a man at a forge who out-negotiated hell. The first named profession in fiction may be this one, and the first plot may be its refusal to pay what it owed. Christian England gave that old smith a bishop's robes. Dunstan, born around 909, died 988, eventually Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, was famous for working metal with his own hands, a prelate with a personal forge, and the legend that grew around him is the old tale wearing vestments. The devil comes to Dunstan's forge in disguise, an old man or a lovely woman, or both by turns, asking for work to be done, and Dunstan, spotting cloven hooves under the hem, keeps his tongs in the fire as he chats. When the iron is white, he spins and clamps the glowing tongs onto the visitor's nose. The devil in the tellings screams so loudly he's heard for miles and flees. At Mayfield in Sussex, a convent long displayed the very tongs, and English children were still chanting a rhyme about the deed centuries later. The saint who pulled the devil by the nose till he roared to be let go. And the story grew a sequel that explains a thing you have seen your whole life. The devil returns, or in some versions asks the smith saint to shoe him, and Dunstan nails a red-hot horseshoe to the cloven hoof, driving the nails into the quick, and only removes it after extracting an oath that the devil will never enter any house with a horseshoe hung above the door. Every horseshoe over every pub door and barn lintel from that day to this is, by the logic of the legend, a signed contract, still in force, nailed up where the other party can see it. France had already given him a halo of its own, and the French story is stranger. Eligius, Saint Eloi, as he became, was a real and well-documented man, a master metalworker born around 588, who rose through sheer skill at the Frankish court, handled the royal treasury, founded monasteries, and died a bishop around 660. He became the patron of smiths and farriers, and the legend the trade told about him for centuries afterward is a small masterpiece of occupational nightmare. A horse is brought to Eligius for shoeing, and the animal is possessed, thrashing, unmanageable, dangerous, the horse every farrier had actually met on his worst day. Eligius solves the problem with terrifying directness. He cuts the horse's leg off. He carries the severed leg to his bench, shoes the hoof at his leisure, calmly, with the leg held in a vice like any other workpiece, and then sets the leg back against the stump, makes the sign of the cross, and the horse stands whole, shod, and cured. Some versions bolt on a second story underneath. Eligius had grown proud, calling himself master of masters, and a mysterious young journeyman, Christ, working incognito at the anvil, performed the leg miracle first, effortlessly, and when Eligius tried to copy it without grace, the blood simply poured until he knelt. French farriers kept faith with all this in a concrete way. By long tradition, no horse is shod on the 1st of December, Eligius's feast, the day the trade's patron holds the hammer and everyone else stands back. The Celtic countries, meanwhile, never entirely decided whether their smiths were holy or dangerous, and settled on both. In Irish and Scottish tradition, the smith was a man of power in the technical sense, The water in his slack tub could cure warts and sickness. Iron from his forge guarded infants against the fairies. A nail or a horseshoe was armor against the other world, and people came to the forge for cures the way they went to a well. And the same power cut the other direction. An Irish smith could curse. The rite remembered in the folklore involved turning the anvil, physically rotating the great stone-heavy block against the course of the sun while naming the victim, and a malediction from a forge was held to be among the worst a person could carry. You wanted your smith friendly. The whole community's relationship to him ran on that doubled current. Bring him your sick child and your broken plough, keep his goodwill and never, ever give him a reason to turn the anvil with your name in his mouth. In England, the trade kept its own feast with gunpowder. St. Clement's Day, the 23rd of November, when smiths celebrated Old Clem by packing the whole of an anvil with powder and firing it, a slab of iron jumping with a bang you felt in your chest. The one day a year the noise was the party instead of the complaint, with processions behind a costumed Old Clem, ale in quantity, and apprentices sent round the houses to beg treats for the trade's honour. The darkest commission in all the trade stories comes next, the nails. Medieval Christianity thought hard about the crucifixion as a physical event, with tools. And tools mean a toolmaker, and somewhere behind Calvary, in the mind of the age, stood a forge and a person who took the order. English art gave that thought a face, and it's a strange one. The Holcomb Bible, a lavish picture book made in England around 1330, shows the scene. A smith is asked to forge the nails for the crucifixion, and he refuses. In the tradition the picture carries, he claims his hand is injured and holds it up, wanting no part of the work. And behind him, his wife steps forward, takes up the hammer, and forges the nails herself. The artist draws her at the anvil, working. In the one place medieval England chose to depict this trade at the hinge of sacred history, the person hammering is a woman, offered as a villainess, inventing an excuse to damn her own household, and, entirely by accident, standing as rare visual evidence that everyone understood a smith's wife could work iron when she chose. The wandering peoples of Europe told the same story from underneath, and their versions have teeth. In traditions recorded from Romani storytellers in the 1870s, carried orally long before that, the soldiers seeking nails for the cross are refused by smith after smith until they come to a wandering smith, an outsider like themselves, who takes the work, and the curse that follows condemns his people to wander the earth without rest ever after. A whole diaspora's hardship explained through one commission at one anvil. And an inverted version answers it. The smith forges 4 nails and steals the 4th, the nail meant for the heart, and for that mercy his people earn a blessing, or at least a license. The road's theirs to travel freely ever after. Ireland ran the same inversion for its own trades. The Irish smith, in their telling, refused the nails outright, and so smiths in Ireland are lucky and honourable, and no Irish smith would drive a nail on Good Friday. It was the tinker who agreed to make them, and the tinker's people wander the roads to this day for it. Every version is the same question worked over a different fire. Who armed the crucifixion, and what did it cost them? And every community answered by pushing the guilt one forge further away from its own. Push the guilt far enough away and you land in the north, at Wayland, and at the story I warned you about at the top of the night. This is the tale the early medieval world told itself about what happens when a king decides a smith is too valuable to be free, and it survives in an old Norse poem, in a long 13th century saga, in an aching Old English lyric called Deor, and carved in whalebone on a little Northumbrian box from the 700s that now sits in the British Museum. The audience for beautiful metalwork knew this story as well as we know our darkest fairy tales. Here it is, uncut. Wayland, Volund in the Norse, Wieland to the English, is the greatest smith alive, a maker whose rings and blades have no equal. A king named Nithad hears of him and wants him, and takes him the practical way. Soldiers come while Wayland sleeps and bind him, and then the queen looks at the captive, at his strength, at the way his eyes follow his confiscated sword on the king's hip and his wife's ring on the princess's finger, and gives her advice. Cut the sinews of his strength, so they sever the tendons behind his knees, hamstringing him like livestock, and the crippled smith is put on an island called Saevastod, off the shore, with a forge and a daily boat bringing orders. He cannot run, he cannot swim. He can only make treasure for the man who ruined him, item after item, while the king wears his sword and the king's daughter, Bodvild, wears his wife's ring. The Old English poem Deor gives him one stanza, and it is all winter. Wieland, it says, knew misery among snakes, alone in bonds of sinew, sorrow and longing his company through the cold. Then the poem's refrain, the line the whole culture apparently found consoling, that passed away. This may too. What passes, in Wayland's case, is his restraint. The king's 2 young sons row out to the island in secret, greedy to see the smith's treasures, and Wayland shows them a chest of marvels and tells them to come back alone, telling no one. They do. And as the 2 boys bend over the open chest, heads down among the gold, Wayland strikes off their heads. He buries the bodies in the muck beneath his forge bellows, where the ground is always turned. And then the greatest craftsman alive goes to work on what remains. The skulls he strips and chases in silver, and shapes into 2 magnificent drinking goblets, and sends to King Nithad. The boy's eyes he sets as glittering gems into brooches for the queen. The woman whose advice cut his tendons now wearing her son's eyes at her collar. The teeth he polishes and strings into a breast ornament for the princess Bodvild. And the royal family, delighted with the smith's latest work, uses it all. The king drinks from his sons at feasts. For months, the finest objects at that court are the court's own missing children, passed around the fire, admired by lamplight, and only the maker knows. Bodvild comes to him last, and on her own errand, she has broken her ring, the ring that was Wayland's wife's, and she wants it mended quietly, without her father knowing. Wayland receives her kindly. He mends the ring. He brings her beer and keeps bringing it, and when she is drunk, the poem says plainly, he rapes her, and she leaves the island carrying his child. That is the vengeance complete by the brutal accounting of the story's own age. The king's sons dead and drunk from, the queen decorated with what she caused, the daughter shamed and pregnant by the slave. Then comes the escape, the detail every carving loves. Wayland has been building wings, in the saga's version, a coat of feathers from birds his brother shot for him. And the hamstrung smith, who cannot walk, rises off the anvil into the air. He hangs there, above the hall, out of all reach, and makes Nithad swear oaths first, that no harm will come to Bodvild or the child she carries. And then he tells the king everything, where the bodies are buried, what the goblets are, what the gems were, what happened to his daughter. The last picture the poem gives us is the king sitting motionless in his hall, knowing that no man alive can pull the flying smith down, while Wayland laughs and goes. The child Bodvild carries, other legends add, grows into a famous hero. The world, in other words, took the smith's side. The saga version adds a final cruelty. In it, Wayland's own brother, Egil, a famous archer, stands at Nithad's court, and as the smith hangs in the air, the king orders Egil to shoot him down. Brother commanded against brother, one hostage spent on another. Wayland had prepared for exactly this. He had told Egil beforehand to aim at a bladder of blood hidden under his arm, and Egil's arrow bursts it. Blood rains down into the courtyard. The king, satisfied he has watched the smith die, lets the body fly away. Even the escape runs on craftsmanship. A prop and an audience shown exactly what it needed to see. The little whalebone box in the British Museum, the Frank's casket, carved in Northumbria in the 700s, puts the scene right on its front panel. Wayland at his anvil, tongs in hand, gripping a skull cup, with a small headless body tucked under the forge at his feet as Bodvild approaches, and carved directly beside it, on the same face of the same box, sharing the panel, the three magi bringing gifts to the infant Christ. Some workshop in Christian England set those two scenes shoulder to shoulder, the gifts of the wise men and the gifts of the maimed smith, and generations of scholars have circled the pairing without exhausting it. Both are stories about craftsmen's offerings carried to a king's child. The box declines to tell you which one it finds more instructive. One more turn of the screw, and it reaches back past the Middle Ages entirely. Smith gods limp. Wayland is hamstrung. The Greek Hephaestus is lame, thrown from Olympus, the crippled maker among the beautiful gods. The pattern of the maimed divine smith, repeats across cultures widely enough that scholars have gone looking for a cause. And one modern hypothesis reaches into the metal itself. Before iron, bronze, and early bronze was commonly alloyed with arsenic. Smelting and working arsenical bronze fills a workshop with arsenic fumes, and chronic arsenic poisoning attacks the peripheral nerves, producing weakness, wasting, and a characteristic damage to the legs and feet. Generations of Bronze Age smiths, if the hypothesis holds, may genuinely have limped, poisoned by their own craft, and the gods made in their image inherited the injury, carrying a workplace disease into mythology for 4,000 years. A hypothesis, argued over like everything in this field, and it sits eerily well beside everything else tonight. A whole pantheon walking with the trade's occupational damage written into their divine bodies. The English landscape kept Wayland on retainer, by the way. A Neolithic burial mound on the Ridgeway in Oxfordshire, near the Great White Chalk Horse of Uffington, has carried the name Wayland's Smithy for at least 1,000 years, a monument already ancient when the Saxons named it, handed to the legendary smith as his workshop. The custom attached to it survived into living memory. Leave your horse at the mound overnight with a silver coin on the stone. Walk away. Do not watch, and by morning the horse will be shod and the coin gone. The invisible smith, still working, still crippled, still paid in silver, and still, the custom is very firm on this point, not to be looked at. People leave coins in the cracks of the stones to this day. When I last checked, they still do. One last stretch of history now, to close the circle. The century that produced our sleepless Norwich writer had been broken in half by something worse than noise. In the summer of 1348, plague came ashore in the south of England, and over roughly 2 years it killed somewhere around 40 to 45% of the population. 4 people in 10, gone, in the time it takes an apprentice to finish half his term. The dying respected no trade, and smiths died like everyone else, at their forges and in their beds above the shop, in the middle of commissions, leaving fires to go cold and half-finished ploughshares on anvils that nobody living knew how to work. Whole manors record their mills idle and their forges silent because the men were in the churchyard. An apprentice who buried his master inherited, at 14, a shop, a debt, and a trade half-learned. A village that buried its only smith discovered, at harvest, precisely what he had been worth. And then the survivors did the obvious thing. With half the workers gone and all the work remaining, every man who could swing a hammer or a scythe raised his price, and the landowning class reacted with something close to panic. In 1349, the Crown issued the Ordinance of Labourers, ordering wages held at their old pre-plague levels, and in 1351 Parliament hardened it into the Statute of Labourers, the same statute whose wage tables I quoted earlier, the 4 pence for a mason and 3 for a carpenter. Those numbers exist because the government of England was trying, in law, to stop working men from charging what a halved labour market said their hands were now worth. Employers were prosecuted for paying too much. Labourers were prosecuted, fined, and set in the stocks for earning too much. and the resentment that legislation planted grew for a generation until it came back to London with an army behind it. But that's a different video. For our purposes, follow the light it throws on the Smiths. Into the decades after the plague, the men at the forges were fewer and busier than the trade had ever known, working against demand that never slackened and pushing into the night hours to meet it. The towns answered with ordinances about noise and hours, the courts filled with neighbours' complaints. And somewhere in Norwich, a man lying awake in the small hours put his fury into 22 lines of verse about the crooked, soot-blackened, drunken devils across the lane, who blew their bellows until their brains should burst and would not let an honest man sleep. Every hammer blow he transcribed was struck by a survivor. The men at that night forge had come through the mortality that emptied their trade, buried their masters and their sons, inherited fires they were never meant to inherit, and were hammering at midnight in part because a maimed workforce was carrying a kingdom's whole iron burden on too few shoulders. None of that is in the poem. The poem just wants them to stop. They never answered him. No Smith's reply survives, no verse from the other side of the lane, nothing in any Smith's voice at all. Men who signed their work in weld lines and hammer marks and left the writing to the people they kept awake. The complaint went into the Priory's book. The book outlived the writer and the Priory and the last forge on that lane, and it sits tonight in a climate-controlled room in London, catalogued as Arundel 292, 22 lines in a spare space, no signature and no reply. And that's where I'll leave you. If you're still awake, fair play. This was a long one and a dark one, and you stuck it out to the cold end of the forge. Tell me below what you'd like me to cover next. The best suggestions on this channel have always come out of that comment section, usually from someone half asleep. Enormous thanks, one more time, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members keeping the lights dim and the research piles tall. Links are in the description and the pinned comment if you fancy joining. Sleep well, keep your hands off anything glowing, and I'll see you in the next one.